Welcome to the latest episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined today in studio with Dr. John Bloom, who is a physicist, an expert in the ancient Near East, and a professor at Biola. And today we're going to be talking about biblical archaeology. You don't want to miss it. Hey, John, welcome to Star Cells and God.
Yeah, and we're talking about something other than stars and cells.
Yeah,
we're still talking about God, though, so that's good.
Yeah, well, John, you're a longtime friend, and not only of me personally, but of Reasons to Believe. So glad to have you on the show. And you are one of the few people who I know that has a dual PhD that in two areas that are really quite different. You're a physicist. You also have a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies and a professor at Biola. So maybe just introduce yourself to the audience a little bit. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, I was interested in apologetics soon after I became a Christian in college. Mm-hmm. As a scientist, the general story is, and people were telling me, is like, didn't you get the memo that God doesn't exist? Science has shown God doesn't exist. So got interested in apologetics early on. Went on to Cornell in grad school, then in physics, and got in with a good church that emphasized apologetics. So the idea there was, if you're well-trained in the sciences, maybe you should get well-trained in theology as well. So I went to seminary and then was going to do Old Testament, but ended up in ancient Near Eastern studies. It was more fun.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of been my focus, is science and apologetics.
Yeah.
And What's kind of fun is that, in my time at Biola teaching physics, I started this MA in science and religion.
Yeah.
And that's to give a condensed background for people in the history of science, in theology, current issues that people are dealing with, as well as a little bit of philosophy, because you got to know how to think some of this stuff through.
Yeah.
So it's
I highly recommend the program. I actually have an adjunct position where I teach some courses in the MASR program. But it's a great program. There's great students. And so I think we're going to put a link in the show notes if people want to find out more about the MASR program. But, highly, recommend it to people that want to go a little bit deeper in the whole science and religion area.
Yep, excellent.
Yeah. Well, today, John, we're going to be talking about archaeology and biblical archaeology in particular. So this is going to be quite a bit of fun because you got some great discoveries in archaeology that affirm Scripture. But maybe to get things started, maybe an obvious question, a simple question, but what is biblical archaeology? And when we hear that area of study, it's not necessarily something that where Christians are running around Israel digging up sites, right?
No, it's just a general term for any archaeology that's done in lands of the Bible. So this can get into Mesopotamia a little bit, into Egypt a little bit, but it's mainly focused in Israel and Judah. So, but anyone who's doing work in that area, secular, Christian, whatever, kind of falls into this biblical archaeology area.
Yeah. Now, do you think it's an advantage when we talk about apologetic implications of these discoveries that people that are working in this area are not necessarily Christians or even Jewish?
Yeah, I think that helps. It makes it a much more neutral in terms of, and it also keeps a Christian always interacting with someone who does not believe in miracles, who's, just the Bible is legend and so on. So as a Christian working in archaeology in these areas, it does have some challenges, but it kind of keeps you honest in that sense too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's remarkable to me just how many archaeological finds there are that affirm the Old Testament, even aspects of the New Testament. And you're going to give us some recent examples that are, again, quite interesting. A few years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of going to Israel, and part of that trip was visiting a number of archaeological sites. And, one of the things that struck me is oftentimes these archaeological sites are affirming passages of Scripture, but they're affirming these minor details that are mentioned in a passage. They're not really affirming the most important theological points of the passage. So respond to that. How should I think about that?
Yeah, those details are often called the throwaway details.
Yeah.
In other words, there's a story and it might mention some person or some geographical location or some aspect of things that you're like, if you're making up the story, you might have the heroes of the story correct, like, David or Solomon or Nebuchadnezzar or something like that. But these other characters and geographical locations are you just make those things up. But those are the things that we find that we can check on often or that we discover often, and they confirm the narrative. So the idea is if the throwaway details are right, then maybe the whole story's right. It gives a lot more credibility to the main theme.
Yeah. So it's actually a good thing that we're discovering evidence for those, quote unquote, throwaway details, because, if you're making it up, why make up that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. What evidence is available to archaeologists? When we talk about archaeology, what evidence is available to study?
Wow. A lot of broken pottery. That's probably the main thing you discover. That was the stuff that you couldn't recycle, so you just throw it away. But there's various artifacts, ancient jewelry. Probably what's most interesting is if you can find ancient writing, because then you can get into people's heads what they were thinking and some of the interactions going on between people in writing. But you get, again, military artifacts, pottery I mentioned, a lot of buildings, what they call, palaces and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a whole range of materials that you find,
But, in some respects, I guess we would have to adopt the position that we're lucky to have what we have, right?
Oh, yeah. That's one of the problems with archaeology is the benefit is you get physical evidence of actual things from the past. The detraction is that we only have a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the original material that was around at, say, the time of David or something like that. A lot of it gets destroyed when the city is looted and burned, so that's the first fraction that you lose. And then people will build on top of the ruins, so the stuff gets buried for thousands of years and decays away. So that's the other fraction that you lose from decay. And then, we've got to find it and publish it so that people know it's around.
Right.
That's the third fraction. So, it's only a tiny bit of stuff from the ancient past that we still have.
And so the challenge is, how do you take really a random selection of material, or maybe there's even a selection effect where certain things are going to be preserved more readily than other things, and how then do you take that fraction of a fraction of a fraction and kind of reconstruct what was going on?
That's the challenge. That's really the challenge, yeah.
Now, in biblical archaeology, though, you have the Old Testament and the New Testament to maybe give some guidance. So is that maybe what makes biblical archaeology distinct from other areas of archaeology, or is that maybe not the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful thing. Although we do have some chronicles from Babylon and Assyria, so as some texts have been recovered from these other cultures, we can fit artifacts into their narratives as well. But I would say the biblical narrative is, again, it's in one text, and we've had it for some time, and it does go from, say, Moses all the way through Jesus and Paul. So we've got a more continuous history there that we can fit things into.
Yeah. So is it considered legitimate then in biblical archaeology to have that dynamic interplay between the text and the archaeological record, or do people feel uncomfortable, relying on the text to help interpret the artifacts?
When you're in Israel proper, people are pretty comfortable fitting the two together. When you go over to Mesopotamia, people are pretty comfortable as well. It's in Egypt where you see almost a disconnect. Egyptologists kind of want nothing to do with the Exodus or anything relating to that time period. So
Interesting.
So
Interesting. Okay, so so you've got a number of examples for us of some recent finds that you believe are impactful in terms of affirming the Old Testament, or at least parts of the Old Testament story. So the first example has to do with C14 measurements at Gezer. So
Gezer is how I pronounce
Gezer,
it.
okay, there you go.
All right.
That's probably the right way to
Better
pronounce
than
it.
being an old geezer. So
thanks for that. Yeah, speaking of being old geezers, right? But so set the stage for us. What is going on with this particular archaeological find? Why is it considered to be important? What issue or uncertainty is it resolving?
The work at Gezer works with the problem of Solomon. Was Solomon a historical king? Was there really a united kingdom under, Saul and David and Solomon and so on?
So this is an active area of debate among biblical archaeologists then.
Yeah. And kind of the story with Gezer starts with Yigal Yadin working at Hatzor in northern Israel back in the 50s, where he found this gate structure, a 6-room gate structure, and that he dated to around the time of Solomon. And he goes, well, that's kind of interesting because the Bible says that Solomon fortified Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer. And McAllister had excavated Gezer back in the 1910 or so. So Yadin goes down to Gezer and says, wow, the gate structure at Gezer matches what I found at Hatzor. Let me go to Megiddo and dig around there and see if I can find a gate. And he found one. All 3 gates are identical. So Yadin said this affirms Solomon, as a king, Solomon as having control of these major cities along a major trade route. So this is awesome. But Israel Finkelstein came along in maybe the 70s and said, no, there wasn't a united kingdom. Solomon's just a myth. So these fortifications must date to the time of Omri or some 8th century time where it was just the northern kingdom and Judah was nothing.
Right.
So that became the debate. What's the date for these 3 gates? And the work at Gezer that just came out is very spectacular because they were able to date the different occupation levels at Gezer. And they found a destruction level below the gate structure. And that would go with what the Bible says about Pharaoh coming and burning Gezer and giving it to Solomon as a dowry for his daughter that was marrying Solomon. Solomon then fortifies Gezer, and they were able to date that level. And then Pharaoh Shishak comes and destroys Gezer during the reign of Rehoboam. And so there's these 3 levels that they were able to date, and they all fit in the 10th century very nicely. The time of Solomon and Shishak and so on. So that confirms then that these are Solomonic gates, also up at Hatzor and at Megiddo. Really gives credibility to the United Kingdom and to Solomon.
Right. Yeah, and so so that's the type of discoveries that we're looking at, but yet which is profound to think that you can really demonstrate that Solomon was a real historical person.
Right, and here's the ruins of the buildings that he left behind here. So I've got some slides in that show some of the gate structures
Yeah.
and so on there too.
Yes,
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, would you just want to talk us through a couple of these slides?
Well, the one picture there is just a beautiful scene of the gate structure. The one that's probably more helpful for viewers is to see the different colors of the different strata, is the technical term, the different layers. And then I've kind of circled the one that shows the 6-room gate structure that seems to very clearly be Solomonic. Identical structures at Megiddo and Hatzor as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so, off the top of your head, what would be a passage in Scripture that people could read that would correlate with this discussion?
This all ties into 1 Kings 9.
Okay.
Verse 15 is the particular one that refers to Solomon fortifying it. Yeah.
Okay, so then there's another example, and this deals with the question of the historicity of David, right? And this is the moat in the city of David. So maybe set the stage for us and then tell us what was discovered.
Yeah, this was one of those real shocks in archaeology, but the history of it, again, I've got another picture that illustrates the problem. The city of David was really tough to conquer. Joshua couldn't do it. You see during the time of the Judges that it's the city of the Jebusites. David's finally able to take it, and people kind of puzzled over why was it so difficult. Because if you look at a picture of the city, the lines here show what was the city of David. To the east and the west and the south, there were very deep valleys around the top of the hill that was the Jebusite city. But to the north, the hill was actually higher, or the Temple Mount is. So you could just walk downhill and take the city of David, you would think. So why was this city so hard to take? Was sort of the archaeological question, at least in my thinking for this. And it turns out, I have another slide here that shows artists' reconstruction of the city of David. But the shock was they discovered this trench or moat that separated the northern hill from the southern part, city of David. And it's a huge trench. It's over 100 feet wide, 20 to 30 feet deep. And it's like, well, no wonder the city was, they cut themselves off and isolated themselves on a single peak by making that trench.
So was it David that produced this, or were people that occupied the city prior to David, or is that not known?
Technically, they don't know. They know that the trench existed before 900 BC. There's some debris in there that they could date to 900 BC, which would be getting into the time of, a little after Solomon. So it existed probably at the time of Solomon and David. And my hunch is that this is what made this city so hard to defend, or so hard to take, was that the Jebusites built it. Maybe it was enlarged later, but the Jebusites built this because they're sitting there saying when David comes to attack them, the blind and the lame can defend this city. And you're like, if it was just a contiguous hill and maybe a thick wall, you can bring battering rams and smash that thing up. So there must have been some barrier there. And this is a great candidate for it. So, yeah.
Okay, so then, so what's the controversy surrounding this?
There's no great controversy over this one. It's more a surprise. The things you discover that, at least to me, sort of fill in a crack. Why was this city so hard to take? And but it's more a surprise than a controversy on this one.
Yeah.
So.
And this would indirectly affirm then the accounts that we see in Scripture of David, at least with respect to the conquest of the city of David then.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, why did they have to, Joab had to go up the water shaft or something in order to break into the city? Well, if there was a big trench there, that would have prevented any direct attack. The hills were too steep. Yeah. That's another thing with it is, you look at the picture, those valleys were much deeper back in Old Testament times. They've erosion and filling them in as the city grew.
Right.
It doesn't look as dramatic as it would have been back for David. So,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
That's good. Okay. Now, are there other discoveries that we could cite that would affirm David and Solomon's existence? I think you've got a list of
Yeah,
three
there's
or
a
four
couple of
these.
other discoveries that have recently been done. This result comes from a general survey of the occupation layers there on the city of David, where they did very careful carbon-14 samples to date. Okay, what's the date for this layer and these different layers? And the surprising result from this dating of about 100 samples from the city of David area from different levels is that about 20% of them dated to the time of David and Solomon. And you go, well, so what? Well, the skeptics would say that Jerusalem was just a backwater village. Again, there wasn't a David and a Solomon. It was all made up later. So the fact that 20% of the samples that they're getting date to that 10th century period implies there really was a city there, and maybe not a megapolis, but enough of a city to be a capital. So that was sort of the surprise from the carbon-14 dating that they were doing, how many samples went to the 10th century, the time of David and Solomon. There must have been a real city there is the point. So.
Yeah, and then let's see. So you talk about the copper mines of David.
yeah. That's some other fun work.
Of Solomon, I guess.
Yeah. One is that we're pretty confident in knowing where Tarshish is.
Yeah.
Where the Phoenicians went off and brought back gold, silver from Tarshish, and so on. Some archaeologists doing work in Spain. The city is pronounced Huelva. Maybe in Spanish it's a little different, but it's Huelva. And that has silver mines that go back to the time of the Phoenicians, back to the 10th century. They've dated them. They've found Phoenician artifacts there. So, and they're still mined today. They were mined in Greek and Roman times, but they were also mined back in the 10th century, the time of Solomon. So we've got a pretty good location for where Tarshish was and artifacts that fit that time.
Yeah, and so I think is my understanding from reading some of the stuff that you provided is that this is significant because it helps to affirm the idea of Solomon's wealth.
Yes,
right.
Yes. Not only did he have the trade routes control
right.
there with Gezer and Megiddo and Hatzor, but he talks about him doing all this trading and so on. The copper mines are particularly interesting because Nelson Gluck went over into Jordan back in the 1950s and found all these things and got all excited about Solomon's copper mines and so on. And then skeptics came in later and said, no, Gluck really overestimated and misdated. It was Egyptian stuff. It wasn't, 10th century, the time of David and Solomon. But groups have gone back recently and done some dating of the slag deposits and so on. And what they discovered is that these copper mines were most active during the time of David and Solomon. The Bible talks about David going in there and starting to mine the copper, and then Solomon continued. And so these things were most active during that time. Yeah, the Egyptians were there back in the 12th century, but the most activity is during the time of David and Solomon. And one spectacular find that they did is not just carbon dating it to date it to the 10th century, but they found some fabric, and I've got a picture of that this is some of the oldest fabric that's ever been recovered.
That's remarkable because fabric doesn't preserve.
Doesn't last, yeah. But the upper right there is some of the royal purple that's dyed from Tyre, the murex shells. So that's the oldest sample of Tyrolean purple that's ever been found. And the other fabric there is spectacular. And what all this signifies is some of the people working there, probably the technical people smelting the copper, were really highly valued people. They dressed in royal clothing. So they had a lot of money, a lot of, again, prestige. And you normally think of copper mines being, and this work being done by slaves, who are there to die. And here you've got these people dressed in essentially royal clothing. And they analyze some of the food scraps as well. And they're eating food that's coming in from the Mediterranean. So this is coming in from Judah and Israel down to Timnah and Fayun, and not coming in from Egypt. So just these little throwaway details are telling you who's mining this area. It's people coming over from the Mediterranean. And of course, that's Solomon and David, Judah and Israel. So.
Remarkable. And then there, you mentioned something about the Phoenician earring. Right?
Oh, yeah. This is a spectacular find. Up in the Temple Mount area, there in Jerusalem, there's an area that became a royal residence near the temple. And what they found digging in some layers there that were dated back to the time of Solomon and David is this beautiful little Phoenician part of an earring. It's just spectacular that it's preserved for thousands of years. But that fits the Bible saying, again, another throwaway details. Oh, yeah, King Hiram of Tyre sent some of his servants down to work with Solomon. And one of them lost an earring, and we found it a few thousand years later. So, just those details that kind of confirm those throwaway bits of the Bible.
So would you say today that most biblical archaeologists would agree that David and Solomon were real historical people and that they actually ruled over significant kingdoms?
The evidence is getting stronger, so I would say there's probably a shift more towards that position. There have been sort of two camps in the archaeological world for some years now. The extreme skeptics that are having a hard time being skeptical, I think. And then those who have sort of always said no, even though the evidence is now it's growing and we're seeing more. But so there's still the two camps there. But I would say that the people who said, no, there really was a David and a Solomon, the evidence is getting much stronger.
So how far back does the biblical archaeological record go? Is it, you mentioned the 10th century, which is David and Solomon. Is there archaeological evidence earlier than that? And if so, what kind of evidence would that be?
Yeah, it depends how far down you dig, I guess, is the short answer to that. And the things that I've focused on here are some of the most recent discoveries.
Right.
And that's been the time period where some of the most recent work has been. But you can get back to the time of the conquest and so on. There's some good evidence, I think, from Egypt, and one can look at for a Israelite presence there in Goshen that you can argue for. So you can get back into biblical history quite well. It kind of gets a little hard with Abraham because how are you going to find one guy in the midst of Canaan? So he kind of fades away into the artifacts from that standpoint. But we can track most of biblical history pretty well. So.
Well, and I guess it wouldn't be any accident that most of the finds are going to be connected to cities, just simply because that's where you're going to have an abundance of materials where the likelihood of something surviving is much greater.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're just living in tents with your sheep herds, how much do you leave behind that's identifiable becomes a problem too. So, yeah.
Okay, so you also want to talk a little bit about the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, I mean, that's an absolutely remarkable story about their discovery. But in general, I think most people see them as being really significant because they show that what we have as the Old Testament was reliably preserved, right?
Yeah.
At least back to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. Prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts we had were dating to around 900 to 1000 A.D. And we had stories about how accurately the scribes would work to copy them, but those were just stories. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've got evidence from manuscripts that are 1,000 years older than what we had before that, no, they really did work to copy these things carefully. So
Right.
That's been real helpful.
Right. Now, and you talk about a precise dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So why is that so important to have that high precision dating? What's going on there in terms of the controversy or the question at play?
Yeah. Well, the more precise you can be, the more accurately you can date the scroll, then that gives you some sense of the history of the copying. And the one result that's particularly interesting here is a Daniel fragment, where, and by the way, it's pretty spectacular. For this study, they were able to actually get pieces of the scroll. Okay, you don't normally want to destroy your sample, but they've gotten good enough and need a small enough piece that they got 30 fragments from Dead Sea Scrolls and some other ones. 24 of them they were able to date reliably. And part of the problem with carbon dating is contamination.
Right.
They've been handled, bacteria have been growing on them. So this study was kind of boasting about how good a job they were able to do and actually date the parchment or papyrus itself free of contaminants. And prior to this, how they would date these fragments is by the style of the handwriting. So, and from a bunch of other texts and so on. And this particular period, from maybe 300 to 100 AD, is very tough to date, because styles were changing. So, and the discovery here was that the carbon date for this and some of the other fragments, most of them were right on target with what the paleographic studies had estimated. But this Daniel text carbon dates to 195 BC. Now, the problem is that this is from Daniel chapter 11, which is talking about the prophecy that includes the abomination and desolation, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, about 167 BC. So here we have a fragment from, and it's a copy from before the time of the prophecy. So that's a little scary if you're a skeptic and you don't think prophecy ever happened, and if you think Daniel was written after 167 BC or something like that. So it's kind of fun in that regard.
Yeah.
Now, the skeptics are still, they point this out, but they still say, yeah, but there's error bars in the carbon dating. So we can still date it to maybe 160. It's right on the fringe of the error bars. But really, if you were just looking at the result, the data and dating it, you'd date it to maybe 200 BC, which would make this thing a clear prophecy.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a fun one that's a challenge to the skeptics, but not so clear in the date that I can declare victory.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, that's really fascinating, because there is quite a bit of controversy about when Daniel was written.
Yeah,
so this is something that really tips the scale in favor of kind of a conservative biblical view. Yeah.
The best they say now is like, wow, we have a fragment from from the same time that the original was written. And
Yeah.
it's like, really?
Yeah.
It actually dates before then.
Yeah.
So,
So when people do the carbon-14 dating, is it typically radiometric techniques, or is it oftentimes accelerator?
they're using the accelerator method. Yeah,
mass
yeah.
spectrometry.
It's
That's
considered to be much more accurate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Now, you also point out that biblical archaeology can be used to resolve biblical difficulties, and there's something you want to talk about regarding Darius. So,
Oh, yeah.
set
yeah.
the stage for that, and
Yeah.
kind of tell us what's going on there.
Well, this one is again a kind of a recent reassessment of the Darius the Mede problem. Again, if you're reading Daniel, you get to chapter 5 or so, the end of chapter 5. Belshazzar is killed, and then Darius the Mede receives the kingdom at the age of 62. And well, there must have been a Darius who reigned for a couple of years, and then Cyrus, who was the general who conquered the city, then became king after Darius. Xenophon talks about a king, the last king of the Medes, who was Cyaxares II. And but nobody else refers to him. And there's no direct cuneiform reference to a Darius the Mede or to Cyaxares as well. So what scholars have done is just, Darius the Mede is some fictional person. He never existed. We don't have any cuneiform records for him. They used to say that about Belshazzar, but we found cuneiform records that confirm everything that the Bible says about Belshazzar, even the point of him making Daniel the third in the kingdom, because Belshazzar was the second. But the skeptics have now focused on Darius the Mede as the fictional character. But a couple of scholars have looked through the historical records carefully and argued that, this Cyaxares really fits the picture of Darius the Mede. And he was an old guy. He was the uncle of Cyrus, who was the general who conquered Babylon. But Cyaxares was the king of the Medes and was over Cyrus at the time. So Cyrus making his uncle king of Babylon makes sense. And the fascinating thing is that Cyaxares was a little bipolar and vain and easily influenced, and then goes into these depressive moods. Kind of the feel you get for Darius the Mede there in Daniel, that he could be, talked into being prayed to for 30 days and so on. So the personality fits. And there are allusions to a king in the cuneiform record, but he's never explicitly named, at least in what we've found so far. So there's a bit of a hole there. So the argument is that Cyrus, when he finally became king and his uncle died, the Persians now became the top empire over the Medes. So to kind of lose the memory of the Medes, they just sort of changed, wiped the record out a little bit. So, but you can make a very good argument that Darius the Mede was Cyaxares, and the personalities fit, the time periods fit. So we don't have a cuneiform text to nail it like we have for Belshazzar, but the evidence to me looks pretty good. So.
Yeah. Now, does this go towards, it obviously demonstrates the reliability of Daniel. Does it help with the controversy about the timing that Daniel was written? Or is the argument, people, could have gone back to those records and have reconstructed an accurate history without it being, an older text?
Yeah, well, this is sort of the thing with Cyaxares. if Xenophon's the only guy who talks about him, and he's kind of lost to history otherwise, by the time you get down to 200 BC or whatever, the fact that, Belshazzar was lost to history as well. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you've got these old kings that are being mentioned and their personalities are even preserved correctly seems to confirm that Daniel really was written at the 500 BC-ish at that time of the claims.
Okay, yeah, I get the idea, because if they're lost to history, then you wouldn't think if there's a more recent date for Daniel, you wouldn't think to include these characters.
Because no one knows about them by the time you get down to 200 BC or whatever. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, we focused quite a bit on the Old Testament. Is there anything else that I've overlooked that you'd like to bring up before we talk about some New Testament discoveries?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, so then let's talk about, when you think about biblical archaeology, a lot of times most people think about it's affirming the Old Testament. But what about the New Testament? Are there archaeological discoveries that give us insight into the New Testament?
It's kind of fun with the New Testament. I was looking for what are recent discoveries that would affirm the New Testament, and there aren't very many because the New Testament is so well affirmed. There's only maybe 2 or 3 issues that show up regarding historicity of aspects of the New Testament. So I don't have anything new and recent because it's so well nailed down. So what I thought,
and that's actually quite significant, right?
Yeah,
is to not to blow over that point, right? So maybe just elaborate on that point just a bit before you talk about what you want to mention.
Just issues with, and you can do a search for New Testament archaeological, Google it, and it's pretty astonishing. But for example, Pilate, Pontius Pilate. The skeptics would say, well, there's really nothing seriously attested about him, from Roman records and so on. And you go, well, he was kind of off in a corner of the empire, so what do you expect? But he did dedicate a temple to Tiberius in Caesarea, and the dedicatory stone that names him and gives his title was found and discovered back in the 60s. So, those throwaway details, if someone's making up stories in the New Testament, those have been filled in very, very well.
So there's a high level of confidence that we can place in at least the historical accuracy of what's being described in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, in the epistles, right?
Yeah. Again, there's a couple points where you'll see people nitpick, and it's usually because we don't quite have enough evidence there yet to fill in that crack, but otherwise it's very strong, yes.
Okay, so then what you're going to tell us a little bit about an older study, I guess.
Yeah. And the reason I bring it up is because this totally reshaped how people view the Gospels, the time for the writing of the Gospels. Because prior to this discovery, skeptics would say, well, John is the last gospel written. That's pretty obvious from the internal evidence. But, no first century Jew would have ever called Jesus God and thought of him as God incarnate and so on. Those are Greek influences that must have come in from Gentile communities in the 3rd century AD, maybe the late 2nd century at the very earliest. So the Gospel of John was probably written around 200 AD or something like that at the very earliest. Just because, again, no self-respecting Orthodox Jew would have ever imagined, God in the flesh sort of a thing. So this papyrus discovery, it's a century old, so it's not recent. But this was the one that shook the whole New Testament studies, because it was found in a trash heap in Egypt, over 100 years ago. It tells you how dry it is once you get couple hundred yards off the Nile, and I was there in August, and yeah, it's hot and dry, okay. Even paper gets preserved. That's what papyrus basically is. It's wood fiber. And it's about credit card size. That's kind of interesting. But it's got enough of the Gospel of John there that you can easily identify it. And the handwriting would date it to about 125 AD. So this is way before the time that the skeptics were arguing that the Gospel of John must have been written. So, and it's in Egypt. And historically, the argument is that the Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John in Ephesus towards the end of his life, about 90 AD. So this pushes John. If you got a copy of it in Egypt in 120, well, it must have been around earlier.
Right.
So this puts John back into the first century, and all the other Gospels then have to collapse back into the first century as well. So it's kind of standard fare now, even in skeptical New Testament scholarship, that all the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the original witnesses, which is a huge change from, again, where we were at with New Testament reliability some years ago.
So if this really pushes the Gospel of John to very close to when people claim that it was written, at least Christians claim it was written.
Yeah.
And if that was the last gospel written, then by inference, you would say the other gospels must have predated it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's the power of it, yes.
Yeah. So, let me close with this question, because we talked just about a handful of discoveries, from archaeology, but it's enough to really, I think, whet people's appetite and to really drive home the point that there's strong archaeological support for the Old Testament and even the New Testament. What impact does this have on you, and personally, what impact does it have with regard to your faith? Why maybe isn't biblical archaeology discussed more when it comes to apologetics? I oftentimes don't see that discussed maybe to the degree that it ought to be.
Yeah, I guess there's, you asked several questions here. I'm kind of an experimental physicist, so I like physical evidence. So to me, the archaeology gives me, here's some physical evidence that Bible history and these people really were historical people, that these events really happened. If the throwaway details are right in biblical narrative, then maybe the main narrative has the basic facts right as well. So to me, the physical evidence is significant. I like the trend that as we find new things, they tend to affirm it.
Right.
So as opposed to, oh, no, we found something that shows the skeptics were right. Well, no, it's going the other way.
And there are plenty of skeptics that are working in this area, right?
Yeah, and that I think is why it's not brought up more, because if you go to many of the popular works out there on archaeology, Biblical Archaeology Review is one example, especially after Herschel Shanks passed on. Shanks used to be very balanced. He'd have conservatives debating with skeptics, so you could kind of feel both sides. It's archaeology, since especially like the 1970s, kind of got taken over by skeptical schools. Mm-hmm. So that tends to dominate the discussion and the orientation now. So there are conservative groups out there that are doing great work in response, but if you just kind of Google, you have to do it with your eyes open and go, oh, well, that's coming from a skeptic.
Right.
What's the other side say? So,
yeah. So why do you think maybe this is feels to me an underutilized area in apologetics? Maybe you would disagree with that, but I don't see a lot of, when I go to apologetics conferences, I don't see a lot of presentations on the latest archaeological evidence that affirms Scripture.
Yeah. Well, you need to do more, Faz. I guess that's the ball's in your court for that one. So,
Yeah. I mean, but why do you think that is? I mean, I think there is a responsibility, to your point, that we do have to maybe try to give more exposure to this area of apologetics. But why do you think it's underutilized? Is it maybe not sexy enough, or?
I'm not sure. You kind of have to get into the weeds a little bit. There's technical details I've sort of glossed over and I've summarized to actually kind of realize, wow, the impact of this actually is significant. So, again, there's many, like in biblical studies today, there's many loud, skeptical voices out there that you kind of have to work around and take their arguments apart. So, but there is a lot of fun, gee whiz, this is cool stuff to it as well. So,
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed this episode. I appreciate your expertise and your willingness to share that with us.
I enjoy this stuff too, so that's fine.
It's fun. It's fun to talk about these discoveries. And again, if people are interested in maybe going deeper in the whole science, religion, science, faith enterprise, there's a great program at Biola, right?
Yeah. It's one of the few in the world, actually. So
that's true. That's true.
And it's, I would say it's the only conservative one in the world, too. So
that's a good point. I know of a few programs that are science and religion programs, but they're highly liberal and
their perspective is they kind of want to maintain the difference, and I see them fitting together very well, such as Reasons to Believe does. So,
And then you also are the author of a book. Tell us a little bit about that book and how people can get a hold of it.
You can Google this. It's on Amazon. It's Crossway approached me to write it. It's called The Natural Sciences, A Student's Guide.
Okay.
And they were doing a series on reclaiming the Christian intellectual tradition university-wide. So there's a book on the humanities and the arts, and they asked me to write one on the natural sciences. So it kind of puts the cookies on the lowest shelf because it's designed to be an introduction for freshmen in college. How can if I'm going into the sciences, how can I think about it as a Christian? So it's actually sold enough copies to generate some royalties. I can take my wife to McDonald's once a year. So.
Congratulations.
But a lot of people have said that they've really enjoyed it. It's that overview book.
It's a good book. I've seen it, and I would recommend it. So well, again, John, thank you so much.
Great.
And thank you for watching this episode of Star Cells and God. We would really like to know what you think about today's episode, so please join the discussion in the comments section below. Also, we would invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe. Use the notification button so you're alerted when the next episode of Star Cells and God drops, which is every Wednesday. You can also get Star Cells and God through your favorite podcast app. Remember to like this video, to share it with a friend, and the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.